Welcome back to Season 12 of the Neuroscience Meets Social and Emotional Learning podcast, where we connect the science-based evidence behind social and emotional learning and emotional intelligence training for improved well-being, achievement, productivity, and results, using what I saw as the missing link. Since we weren't taught this when we were growing up in school, the application of practical neuroscience. I'm Andrea Samadi, an author and an educator with a passion for learning, and launched this podcast 6 years ago with the goal of bringing all the leading experts together in one place to help us to apply this research in our daily lives. On today's episode, number 340, we welcome John Ford. He's the author of Peace at Work, the HR Manager's Guide to Workplace Mediation, who's an experienced workplace mediator and works as a conflict resolution coach and workplace mediator. He's also a past president of the Association for Dispute Resolution of Northern California and served as managing editor for Mediate.com for over 10 years. He currently teaches negotiation and mediation. Now, when I saw the work John's been doing, providing soft skills training on communication, conflict resolution, emotional intelligence, assertion, negotiation, mediation, dealing with difficult behavior, customer service, nonverbal communication, and I could keep going on, all the topics like de-escalation, stress management, diversity and inclusion. Well, I knew I had to have him on the podcast. I saw the importance of teaching our next generation of students these important social and emotional learning skills well over 25 years ago when I was working with 12 teenagers who turned the results in school and sports and their personal lives around in a matter of weeks with these skills. And I just had to learn more about John Ford's pathway that took him from practicing law to working on workplace mediation, training others in these important emotional intelligence training skills. Let's meet John Ford and see what we can learn from his vast experience with conflict resolution to see how he gains trust with a calming effect in the most difficult and tense situations. Let's meet John Ford. Welcome, John Ford. I want to thank you so much for meeting with me today. And I didn't ask you, where are you located? You're East Coast somewhere?
Yes, I'm in Oakland, California.
Oh, you're Pacific time, same time as me.
Yes, yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. We're on
Okay.
the same time zone. Yep.
Okay, sounds good. Well, welcome. John, I want to thank you so much for reaching out to me. We were just chatting a minute ago as we were getting started here. And I just want to say that when I came across your work, I thought this is something that I personally need. I need to stop and learn these skills. So this is not only an important topic for, the listeners and everyone in the world, but I'm actually taking in every single question and I want to use this personally. So I want to thank you for the work you've done and for being here today.
Well, you're most welcome. I think one of the realities that we all confront in life, that we shouldn't have to confront it, maybe it's to embrace it, is that conflict is inevitable. So no matter the quality of our relationship, how close we are to someone, how special they are to us, inevitably there will be conflict. And so developing that skill of being able to address it in a productive, healthy manner, I believe, is something that we should all attend to. And sadly, when we look around our world, we can actually see the opposite, that for the most part, humans are afraid of conflict. They look the other way. They don't have the skill set. And to me, that's sort of a tragic shame.
I agree. I agree. So, John, can you share what inspired you to transition from practicing law to focusing on workplace mediation and soft skills training, which is really what it is?
It definitely was a journey. So I'm originally from South Africa, which I think, as most people know, we dealt with the horrors of apartheid, and so I was very aware growing up in a society that was at a conflict with itself, that I wanted to make a difference and be a force for change, and that was ultimately what led me to law. I saw that as a vehicle for that. But when I practiced law, and by that time I'd moved from South Africa to Namibia, what I constantly found was that there were missed opportunities for people to come together. So, for example, in the law firm that I was at, I was expected to handle a few divorces all the time. And say the wife would come in and sit down and say, "We just want to have a civil divorce." And I'd say, "Sure, I'll do my best to support you with that." And then they would go off, or the husband would go off and see another attorney. And then, as I would sort of say, all hell would break loose. And I'd be like, "What happened to that civil? Let's work it out." Just like when we were, yeah, in our 20s and we broke up, we parted ways with some degree of respect. And so what I started doing is I'd say, if the wife or the husband came in and said, "I want to keep it civil," I'd say, if you want to keep it civil, you're going to probably have to invite your spouse into my office and we'll work it out together. So essentially, what we would do is we'd close the door. And although it's strictly speaking unethical for an attorney to represent both sides, I figured it was worth making an exception. And we'd sit down and we'd hammer out their settlement agreement and then essentially allow the courts to rubber stamp their private affairs. Another arena where I always had an interest was in labor and employment law. And so, again, as a young attorney, I started sitting as the chairperson of conciliation boards. So, when the company and the union got stuck in negotiations, I'd get called in. Now, at that point, I didn't even really know the word mediation. I hadn't trained as a mediator. I was just doing what seemed sort of sensible. And when I arrived in California in 1996, as I like to say, I discovered mediation on the streets of San Francisco because there was I think it's still around, an organization called the Learning Annex. And I picked it up as a little catalog of all these trainings. And one of them was learn how to be a mediator. I was like, oh, this is so great. And so I went off to this thing thinking in one evening I was going to learn how to be a mediator. But the good thing was that it sort of set me on my path because when I heard about that, I was like, wow, this is exactly what I want to be. And I'll continue just a little bit further to get to the workplace because as an attorney coming here, discovering mediation, my initial thought was that I was going to mediate litigated disputes. And it's a great thing that in this country, most superior courts, most the district courts around the country have mediation programs. And to me, that's great. That's needed. But as I was getting started and I was doing informational interviews, someone pointed out to me that the true gatekeepers to these litigated disputes are the attorneys. And that if I wanted to be a mediator of litigated disputes, I would probably have to go and practice law, gain credibility with other attorneys, and then they would start referring the cases to me. And I honestly I didn't have the patience for that. And I was like, no, I want to mediate now. And then someone else said to me, swim upstream away from the courthouse. Every dispute that you're handling, and by then I'd got on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's their mediation panel, and so I was seeing all these cases were sort of roaring and heading towards the courthouse, but all of them started upstream away from the courthouse. And so in many ways, that's really what I focused on doing is how can I be a mediator of workplace disputes early on, just the sort of the conflict is starting to emerge, we can take care of it then. The unfortunate necessity of escalation and just the pain and drama of a conflict going towards court could be avoided.
This is really powerful. And as you're talking, your voice is so calming. So I can see how everything is coming into play here. It's the skills, you're not going to learn it overnight how to do this, but I can feel it in you. And I've got to just ask about some of your influencers because we've talked about Daniel Goleman, the author of Emotional Intelligence, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, even John Gottman's evidence-based research and going into
Mm-hmm.
Paul Ekman's work on facial expressions. So can you just put everything in, all your influencers, and say, you didn't learn it overnight, but who influenced you the most to get to where you are?
Mm. Well, that's a lovely question, and there's definitely the four that you just mentioned there were certainly big on the stage of being influencers, and maybe I'll touch on all of them, but there definitely were more. I think one of the big things along the way was as I was getting started as a mediator and I started moving into training and teaching was teaching at a local university called JFK University with a colleague of mine, Lean Barker. And I remember us having this conversation of like, well, what about the role of emotions in conflict resolution? Because both of us are trained as mediators. And for the most part, let's just say back in the day, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on the role of emotion. And so one of my big influences that sort of got me started moving towards understanding the role of emotion in conflict resolution was a guy called Ken Cloak. He's the founder of Mediators Beyond Borders, and he wrote a book at the time called Mediating Dangerously. And he essentially sort of opened up, at least for me, the field to the role of emotion. So, with that sort of said, because remember, I was at that point, and I still am a mediator, it, as I said, opened the door. And so, Goleman, of course, provided me with the framework. In his first book, he had a slightly more complicated. There were five different components to it, but I really loved his more simple: be aware, self-aware, self-manage yourself, be socially aware, and then manage your relationship. So that simple framework that most people can relate to, I found super, super powerful. The other thing that I found helpful from Goleman was understanding about how emotions were contagious. In other words, we're part of an open system. So just like you're saying, I'm influencing you now, just how we're speaking, that speaks to that. But just to have that validation of, yes, that's true. Damasio was a quote that he had, which I really loved, and I might be not getting it not perfectly, but he would sort of say something to the effect that the neural networks of reason are enmeshed with the emotional networks of reason. And to me, what he really helped me understand was, yes, there are the different regions. There is the cortex with its higher level functionality. There's the limbic system and the reptilian brain. And I always loved that. And I didn't like it when the neuroscientist told me that that model's sort of going away. So I still rely on it, but what Damasio really helped me understand was that even so, even despite that, if we call that function, regional functionality, everything's interconnected. And from that, what I've really come to both understand sort of intellectually, but also to see it in my practice is how emotion drives reason more than reason drives emotion. And that's so key in conflict resolution, really sort of embracing that. And the story I love, just to anchor that for everyone, it comes from when I teach at UC Law in San Francisco. There's another great book on negotiation that includes this little vignette. But imagine you encounter two friends sitting on a park bench, and you come up to them and you say to them, "I've got $100 bill here, and I'm going to give it to person, let's say to person A. And person A, you're responsible to divide this $100 bill, not physically, but to say, I'm going to keep $50, and you, my friend, person B, are going to get $50. And the person B, all they can do is either accept or reject. They can't negotiate, they can't haggle. Whatever the person A says the division is going to be, your choice is to accept or not. So everyone would agree 50-50. They will hug in, they love one another, and they walk away together. But let's imagine the person who has to make the division says, but I have the responsibility of this making this choice, so I should get a little more. So I'm going to take 60, you get 40. You'd probably still be happy at that point, right? But as you can see, we could go all the way down to, I'm going to keep, if it's person A, $99, and you get to keep $1, at which point, and it probably would be before you even got there, that you would want to employ your middle finger in some ways and start using expletives and telling the other person how unkind and unreasonable they were.
Right.
Well, that I just always think it's just that classic example that helps us understand how we make our decisions more emotionally than rationally. Because from a purely economic, rational point of view, $1 is better than zero. So that was the Marcio sort of, and that was huge. That really is huge, really understanding how important dealing with emotions is for conflict. And then Gottman, I don't know even where to start with him because he has produced so much. What I truly love about him is a lot of the field of, I'd say psychotherapy, conflict resolution, just communication is a lot of it's informed by what I just described as intuitive knowing, intuitive knowledge, where we just say, that seems like a good idea. What I love about Gottman is he's evidence based. So he's researching and he's demonstrating things. And so there's been a lot of myths about, just say, for example, our relationship with anger, that he really helped us sort of reframe and rework, and that's been huge. And I could say a little bit more about anger in a moment if you wanted. But the other big thing from Gottman that I don't know how many times I've quoted the statistic is where he talks about the difference between in any, and he's talking about marriages, but I extend this into any relationship. He says that in any relationship, 31% of your issues are resolvable, and then 69% are what he calls perpetual problems. And so when I'm mediating, with between two employees or a group of employees, and I mention that, it just helps them to normalize the experience that they're having, to understand, because once we get beyond what I call skin deep diversity, which to me is sort of, it's tragic that we've got so hung up on how much melanin we've got on our skin. And at the same time, I don't want to discount the horrors and the pains that people have been subjected to because of that. But it's crazy that we make such a big deal about it. To me, what's much more interested when we're thinking about diversity is our more nuanced personality structures. And so I'll often at this point introduce the Myers-Briggs and say, imagine one of you is introverted and extroverted. Guess what? There's going to be a little rub, right? You're going to have a little bit of friction there. If you're in a relationship, the extrovert's going to be, 11 o'clock Friday night, the party's just getting started. And the introvert is like, I've had a good time, but I want to go home. So not the one isn't the party pooper, the other one isn't a party animal. They're just different, and they need to manage that different intersection because that's come up for them. Or some of us are more analytical and some of us are more intuitive. Well, guess what? If you're working with a colleague of yours who's analytical and you're intuitive, you're going to have rub. You're going to have stuff that you're going to have to deal with. And it's not because you either of you are bad. In fact, there's a great opportunity when the two of them start working together. Or with Myers, just to keep going, there's the thinkers and the feelers. Some folks follow the rule book and they won't make exceptions. This is what the rule says. And then you've got the feelers, the bleeding hearts, that like, no, we can't let that happen. It's going to be a tragedy. We've got to make an exception here. But again, you just start seeing where some of the mischief in life comes from the beauty of us being diverse. And then again, working back to Gottman, normalizing it, saying, understand that's what you can expect. Some of these issues you can put to bed. And then in your unique relationship with this particular person, and that's what as a mediator, I always just say, we just have to identify, and I do something like version of this. I say your friction points, and whatever has been a friction point or an issue of contention or uncertainty or confusion becomes an opportunity for clarity. But anyway, as I say, I could go on with Gottman. I haven't even got to his love lab and how he brings to the fore contempt, which brings us into our last character, right? That you mentioned, Mr. Paul Ekman, Lie to Me, and the
Oh,
sort of a big sort of played a big part in these two great movies, Inside Out 1 and now Inside Out 2, and really put to rest the debate about whether nonverbal, and especially facial expressions, were universal or culturally specific. So that was just a good sort of just a solid one for humanity of saying, look, when someone grimaces, whether it doesn't matter what part of the world they're from, we can interpret it the same way, and also understanding just how reliable and powerful the face is as a conveyor of information about what's going on in the feeling realm, which again, as I say, is so important. But anyway, those certainly were huge. I mentioned Ken Cloke. Another, if I may, I'll mention two other authors that have definitely had a impact on me. One, because I know of your specific interest in neuroscience, is Dr. David Rock, and I'm a big fan of his just sort of simple uh, guidance around, just about how the brain works. Probably my big takeaway from him has been what he calls name it to tame it. That idea that when we acknowledge what we're feeling, it can be so helpful. They say it can reduce our stress levels by up to 50%, but it starts moving the energy from those more primitive parts of our brain center into those higher functioning ones where we're having to classify what it is that we're feeling. And it makes it very hard for us to have that more, again, I'll just use that word, primitive response to it. So when we can name it, we can often get a bit of perspective and respond with more wisdom and with more care to our life situations. And then the final one, and then I'll stop because it would be unfair for me not to mention this guy, William Ury. And I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was the co-author of a book called Getting to Yes. You may have heard that one.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
that's been a game changer for the whole of the field of negotiation, conflict resolution, and really understanding how when people get into conflict, typically where we'll see it is the person will say, "This is my solution. This is what I want," and the other says, "Well, this is what I want," and they batter away at one another like this. And what Uri and his co-author Fisher helped us understand is that when people get into conflict, they inevitably will want to have a demand or a position that they want to take. That beneath the surface, each of them has got underlying, and they in that book they use the term interests, but you can also use the term needs. And I found needs resonates with people a little bit more. But when we understand that, it's a true game changer. And I'll tell you just a quick story, and then I really will be done with my little review of all of these influences. But it's a famous story. It's in that book, and I often tell it as the story of two children fighting over an orange. And it's really emblematic of the field of conflict resolution. As I say, it illustrates that not this, but rather going down to the underlying needs approach. So imagine you've got your two kids, let's say a boy of 12 and a girl of 14, and you've had a rewarding day at work and you're driving home and you're thinking, all I want is just some peace and quiet. I just want to be able to put my feet up and relax. And there's no one else at home other than your two children. As I always like saying, there's no orange tree in the backyard. You pull in the driveway, you park, door opens just like it should, excepting as you open the door, you hear there's a little bit of noise coming from the kitchen and it's not friendly. You can tell your children are having some kind of an argument, and you get into the kitchen and there they are, and they got their grubby paws over the one remaining orange in the in the kitchen. And what do you do? So what's your thought, Andrea? What did you do? There you are. You want peace and quiet. Remember that.
Yeah, that's what I strive for daily. I've got the
Uh-huh.
spa music playing to make the house calm. We're trying daily to avoid stuff like this. So I would probably say, what's happening?
Yeah,
What's
that's a
going
nice.
on?
Well, there you go. But that's your wisdom coming to the fore. And if you did, it might play out better than what typically happens. So when I prompt people with this, I'd say probably the most common response I get is the let's cut it in half, right? In other words, we split the orange, and that's sort of it's nice that people will often reference that because that's sort of it helps us understand that as humans, again, you can go around planet Earth and you can present a dilemma like that. We've got a limited resource, and there's two of us. Pretty much universally, culturally, people understand the fairness of splitting a shared resource. So if we, in terms of my little story, if we play it out like that, the one kid cuts the orange, and that's also another key little preventative lesson. Like the one that cuts shouldn't choose, right? That's a preventative technique. So let's say you have your boy cut the orange, he cuts it as best as he can in the middle, and then he presents it to his sister. Sister chooses it, and her sister takes her half of the orange and she goes off and she gets that little juicer and she starts making orange juice, right? Which no surprises there. But it's your boy that provides a little bit of the intrigue because he heads to the part of the kitchen where you have your baking equipment. And you notice there's a baking bowl out, there's a recipe book, there's even some flour dusting the countertop. You'll also notice how I'm breaking down a little bit of some stereotypes because your boy, you discover, is making a cake. And to make the cake, he needs the peel of the orange for that zest, right? And then everyone goes, right. Again, though, with your approach, may have led that way where, like, what's going on might have led, well, I'm thirsty and I want orange juice. I'm hungry and I'm making a cake. But again, we often rush to the solution. So, the two key lessons from this little story is one, when we're in our conflict situations, is not to make assumptions about what the other person's needing, and then also structure the conversation so that you can discover what the underlying needs are. So again, we're getting away from positions and then we discover what the underlying needs are. And it's at that level of underlying needs that we often find that potential for the win-win solutions. And that whole body of work that builds on that basic insight we have courtesy of this guy, William Ury, and Roger Fisher from the program on negotiation at Harvard. And that was also a huge influence on me.
That answer it took me back to, why I started this podcast, why I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to connect emotional intelligence, social emotional learning to neuroscience. So when I saw those influencers for you, I wondered how they connected. And you just took me on the past 6 years of what I've been trying to build on this podcast is connecting these two together, understanding how our brain works. But there's so much. It's like, when you said you can't take this in an overnight course, this has been 6 years. This has been, and I've been doing the social emotional learning stuff since the 90s. And this is how many years have you been on this path? When did that,
Right, exactly. Yeah,
right?
so for me, as I say, well, truthfully, I think we've been on the path from the minute we started trading tears for attention as little babies,
Yeah.
right? So we've been negotiating and then also dealing with our emotionality, right? It's not like we say at a point in time you suddenly became emotional, right? You were that was as you were developing as a young child, the emotional layers were coming on. In fact, going back to the Ekman and the nonverbal stuff, they would say, and Ekman, I think I got it from Ekman, but I know he refers to Charles Darwin, who would say, imagine you've got a blind baby that's warm, it's being fed, it's comfortable. You would expect to see a smile on its face. So you say, like, how did that little baby know to smile? It's because we're hardwired, and in many ways, nonverbal communication is our first language. So more just what I'm really trying to say, Andrea, is we've all, as humanity, are all doing this all the time. This is our subject matter of how we get along. And then some of us choose through our careers to focus on it. And again, when I look back, initially, as I say, I think I was more motivated by the desire for social justice in my country where I was living, and that led me to law. But through the law, it got me into conflict resolution, and then sort of a series of, I don't know, chance sort of happenings kept pointing me more towards not just being a mediator, but a mediator that focused on relational disputes as opposed to transactional. And really, like I said, with that Ken Cloak guy back, that was in around about 2000, where I got that insight of like, it's all about dealing with the emotions first before you do the problem solving and figure out what the solution is. And so you're right, I've been a constant student and learner and not just learning, but also through the practice of actually being the mediator. And then guess what? It's one thing to mediate with others, and then you also eventually have to start applying these principles to your own life. So all of that is very enriching.
Mhm. It definitely. And then that's what I'm noticing as I'm listening to you and looking at the questions that I've come up with. I'm just fascinated. I can't I could go on with for a week with this. This could be a week conversation because there's so much. But
Mhm.
I'm just gonna go to the next
Keep
question.
going. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I could stay on that one with the influence
Right, right.
where it all goes for the rest of the time. But I'm thinking now of applying this to the workplace, right? That's
Hmm.
where a lot of conflicts come in. A lot of the books that you had mentioned were important for you, like difficult conversations or nonviolent communication. What should we in the workplace be thinking about how to apply this to help? With situations that happen day to day in our work lives.
Oh, so that's a lovely question to ponder, to think, well, how's the best way for me to frame that for folks? So one model that I found you really useful in terms of thinking of relationships in the workplace is courtesy of another author, Patrick Lencioni, who wrote a book called The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And unfortunately, the title to my mind was the unfortunate piece because it's got that five dysfunctions, and we could reframe it in a positive direction. But what he really helps us understand is the foundation of whether it's a team in context, or even just a regular one-on-one relationship with a colleague that you're working with. The foundation of that is trust. So in the workplace, when there's trust, everything's going to be better. When you come you're in a workplace where there isn't trust, everything's going to be hard, because now when you don't trust people, you have to take the time to verify and to make sure that they've done what they said that they were going to do. Whereas when there's trust, they say they're going to do it, and you breathe a sigh of relief and you get on doing your thing, and they're going to do it. So that to me is one of those foundational pieces of saying there needs to be trust. And trust, I always like teasing out, is just quickly saying there's the reliability piece that I was alluding to. There's also that piece of, am I safe in your hands? In other words, can I be vulnerable with you? And if people are not safe in the workplace to be who they are, all of that just puts psychic, emotional strain and stress on them, and then it's going to play out in the quality of the relationship. So that to me would be the first piece of the puzzle. The second piece that he sort of talks to in his five dysfunctions is he calls it the fear of conflict, and this is where it directly ties in with me. And it also, I know one of your questions was going to be asking me about how some of the work that I did in the Kalahari with the San influenced my work. And the San still to this day live a sort of semi-nomadic lifestyle as hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari. And so it's a very harsh, difficult environment in which they're living. So for them, getting along isn't sort of like optional, it's part of survival. And one of the things I learned from my time with them was that they have an expression where they essentially say, not talking is wrongdoing. If you have an issue and you don't talk about it, you're putting everyone's well-being in harm's way. If you've got an issue with someone, you need to address it. And so that fear of conflict is that second. Remember, I said trust is the foundation, and then we have the fear of conflict. That's huge. And when we have that sort of fear of conflict sort of sets in, there's this Lencioni coined a nice phrase. He called it artificial harmony. So in other words, in the workplace, there's this absence of trust. People don't feel safe with one another, don't feel like they can count on one another. And they're also afraid of speaking up and keeping it real and saying what's really on their mind and just pretending. And you get there like, how are you doing? I'm fine. I'm okay. And you're like, that is so code for the exact opposite, right? So you know that. So that avoidance of conflict, there's also the avoidance of emotions, the lack, people just don't have the skill set. So when people do get into a conflict, um, the tragedy to me is always that they often are trying to resolve it, but going about it in the worst possible way. So, like for example, if let's imagine you and I were colleagues, and we'd have to chat about or talk about certain things, and I started noticing over time that when you and I would have conversations, I might start the conversation wanting to tell you something, but by the end of the conversation, you were talking and I never got to finish what I wanted to say. So you can notice how I'm trying to just describe it without using any label. But let's imagine I finally broke, like I couldn't take it anymore. It's like, Andrea, right, you've just done it again. And then I say, so in other words, the unity and the wholeness, the connection that you and I may have experienced as colleagues has now been broken. And I think I need to tell Andrea to stop doing that so we can get back to being harmonious. So I say something like, you're rude. You always interrupt and you never let me finish talking or something like that, but something along those lines. Now, you're rude. Like you're going to probably want to have something to say about that. Always and never are also in the right problematic words, because generally always means more than I'd like, and never means not enough. But those are loaded, coded words. But what I'm really trying to do is just saying to you, hey, Andrea, stop doing that. And then we can go back to being harmonious. But guaranteed, you're going to bring in you'll want to get defensive because I've just attacked you. And that just reminds me of that's the other great contribution of Gottman is his four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Yeah. Defensiveness, criticism, stonewalling, and contempt, right? So there you would want to get defensive, and you would get defensive and you say, no, I don't, and you do too, and we'd be off to the races. And now our relationship is now definitely heading in a wrong kind of a direction. So again, I would say just in terms of using that simple model of Lencioni's, even if I just get as far as that, I would say that would be my answer of saying, I'll keep going a little bit, but I'd say lack of trust, fear of conflict, people don't have the skills, and so they instead of talking about their issues, they're adding baggage. They're all walking around with baggage from the past of their unresolved issues. So you've got that, and then on top of that, there's often what I just could describe as really like ambiguity around the things that we've committed to. So one of the dilemmas we face is that some folks are passive aggressive. So we may have a conversation with someone, think that we've committed to a particular course of action, And the person who's passive aggressive may have said to you, yeah, I'll do that. But meanwhile, privately inside, they're thinking, hell no, I'm not going to do that. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a good idea, but they don't speak up. And so there, I think we have an agreement, and they might even suggest to me that they have an agreement. But from that passive aggressive point of view, they forget, they sabotage, or they undermine. But in any event, the other arena where I see a lot of friction emerging is around decision making. In other words, do we have, and this brings us into negotiation, two yeses equal an agreement? But are they genuine yeses? And a lot of the time we don't have that confidence of knowing that the other person is a genuine yes. If we don't have genuine yeses and we don't have commitments, and as I say, there's that sort of ambiguity about what we've committed to, that's never pleasant. And then it also makes it very hard for us to hold one another accountable. So again, if you're in an organization where you've set as a goal, you've said like, this is the path that we want to walk down, and then you observe your colleague leaving that path, as I always say to folks, the first thing you have to decide is when you perceive someone leaving the path, is the agreement that we all look the other way or that we speak up. And again, that goes back to not speaking as wrongdoing. Think of how often in an organizational setting where we observe people doing things, we're like, why are they doing that? I thought we are meant to do this, but they're not safe to speak up
Right.
and they keep quiet. And when all of these things happen, standards start dropping and you have terrible morale. People stop worrying. They're no longer putting the team first, they're putting themselves first. But that sort of would be my best way of describing it, as I say, using that lens or that model of Lencioni of the five dysfunctions of the absence of trust, fear of conflict, ambiguity around decision making, failure to hold people accountable. And then at that point, you get to the fifth dysfunction, which is really an inattention to results. You're no longer focused on the group good, but really your individual good. And a final, just to frame another way of just sort of simplifying it would also be just to say the biggest challenge I see is flows from that avoidance. In other words, people not being willing to speak up, and then when they can't avoid, they go from avoid, 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 and then bam, they come down with a heavy-handed kind of an approach, and that's often the case with leadership. In other words, where they have the power over people, they'll ignore the conflicts as a manager, and then it'll show up on their radar that there's this conflict in their department they need to do something about. They've ignored, and then suddenly out of the blue they come down with a heavy-handed approach to the situation that just makes it worse.
So what's the resolution? If you have all these things in the workplace, then do you have to bring in somebody to get rid of it, or is there a way
Well,
to go?
you can, but there's definitely a lot of things that you can do, and that sort of really brings me to what I feel inspired to be doing at this point in my career, Andrea, which is figuring out how can we bring the tools of the mediator to everyone, and instead of having to bring in that external professional, what are some of the simple little, I don't want to say tricks or actions that a mediator take that could be helpful? So, for example, you've heard me repeatedly sort of say this thing about people need to overcome that fear of conflict, that avoiding of conflict, because if you don't speak about it, it's never going to get addressed. So that's the first thing. And as mediators, when I work as a mediator, one of the things that I ensure is what I call structural balance. In other words, if I'm mediating with two people, I'll have person A share their perspective and I'll summarize it. And I'll say, right, what about you, person B? What's your perspective? And they'll share and I'll summarize it. So they're both getting approximately equal airtime. They're both being validated and they're both being heard and having their experience acknowledged. So that to me is huge in mediation, and again goes back to that research about emotions. When we can acknowledge both people's valid experience, because in any conflict, no matter what's happened, each person has their valid, true lived experience, and the last thing we want to do is invalidate that. So what I often observe is when people overcome that a fear of conflict and they decide, yeah, let's talk. Now they sit down and talk, and you have what I'd call a lopsided conflict resolution conversation. In other words, one person's doing all the talking, or it could be that the one person is framing the issues. So like imagine if it's again you and me. If we're in a conflict, I might sort of describe it in one way, and you'd say, okay, I can relate to that, John. But if I describe the conflict, I would describe it a little bit differently. So two things, the time sort of piece and who gets to frame what the conflict's really about. So one of the tools that I offer is a talking stick. So this is a nice sort of colorful one. I also have a nice giraffe one that ties in with the world of nonviolent communication, where the heart that has to pump the blood up its long neck is its mascot. But really, you don't need to have an elaborate tool like, like one of my ones like this. You could just use a pen. And what you're really doing is you're having a sort of some object that's going to help you define who's the speaker and who's the listener. And the simple rule of the talking stick is the person with the talking stick is the speaker, and the other person or the other persons are the listeners. And their only job is to demonstrate to the speaker that they've understood the speaker. And when the speaker feels understood, they say, I feel understood. And then they pass the talking piece, whatever it may be, to the other person. Now, as infantile as that may be, that's huge, just getting that. And again, that's one of the things that mediators accomplish. So that's one of the things that I think can be super helpful, of just having a practical tool like that. And again, it could be a feather. As a family project, you could maybe go and find a little twig in a forest and then, all work to create it and to make it like your family piece, as it were, that you use to define who's the speaker and who's the listener. The other big thing that's been a true game changer for me is understanding that in conflict, there are two key conversations. There are conversations about what we're feeling, and then there are also conversations about what we're needing. And the more we can attend to those two key conversations, and again, a lot of this comes from the work of Marshall Rosenberg and nonviolent communication, where he put a lot of emphasis on feelings and needs. And in fact, one of his definitions of empathy, or the way he describes it, is to say when we acknowledge another person's feelings and needs, we're giving them empathy. So in our conflict conversations, and again, imagine you're at home or just with your friends and family, you have your talking stick to help you define who's the speaker. And then what I have are these, I'll quickly show you, there with these feelings cards, oops, feelings and needs cards. Oh, yeah, okay, they've gone. There we go, needs. And what they essentially are is prompts. So a lot of the time, again, because we have avoided our emotionality and things like that, you say to someone, what are you feeling? And I hate to say it, especially to the males, like, huh, feeling? Have I got feelings? What do you mean, what am I feeling? They don't know. We're not always in touch with our feelings. So what these cards do, they really serve as prompts where you can just say, so what are you feeling? Are you feeling angry? Are you feeling anxious? Are you feeling calm? Are you feeling comfortable? Are you feeling compassion, confident, etc.? And they serve as prompts, and they get people in touch with the truth of what they actually were feeling. And so in our conversations, if we sit down and attend to both the feelings, and that often helps us to make peace with the hurt and the pain of the past, and then we focus on the needs gives us clues as to what it is that we need to do in the future differently. In other words, so if I have as a simple little example I always give is, if someone's feeling confused, I'd say, well, it sounds like you need clarity for the future. And they're like, yeah, exactly. And then we'd help them get to that clarity. But in any event, I've found that's been sort of where my work has been going more and more, Andrea, is trying to provide tools. And actually, in addition to selling these cards, the feelings and needs cards, I've now developed an app that essentially allows people to get in touch with, for any particular situation or a particular relationship or maybe an event, something that's happened, and have a series of cards that they can just review and identify which are the ones that apply to them. As I say, both of those sort of things are ways of making the skill or the practice of conflict resolution more accessible to the public.
So the empathy cards and the talking stick, they would work really well in a school as well as even in the corporate world in meetings.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I can say I've used the talking sticks and the cards in all, up into the C-suite of pretty large organizations. But also, I always say that in any organization, the folks up in the C-suite, they matter, and the janitor matters too. Everyone's doing an important job. So I've worked from the janitor to the CEOs with the cards, with the talking sticks, and people relate to them. In fact, part of what I find is with them is it also almost makes it a little fun. It sort of gives people something else to sort of think about, to talk about. And but yeah, no, it's definitely been helpful. The other, you mentioned the school. So as I say, most of my work has been in the workplace. But I think it was last year. I have some friends up in Garberville in Northern California, and one teaches at a school. And I had shared with her the cards, and then she told me how on one day, I think it was two boys got into a fight over a lunchbox. And so they came back to the class, and she was like, "What do I do? What do I do?" And she said, let me try the cards." And so she got out the cards, and I think she had already helped them with the feeling cards, and she had them with the needs cards. Now, I'm not sure if I'll be able to find the need that looking for. But anyway, in one of the cards in the pack is, let me see, I'm not looking for it, not showing up. Uh, where is it? I'm looking for a card that says understanding. Anyway, I can't find it.
Okay.
This kid, so she spread out all the cards, and one of the cards said understanding. And when he saw it, she said he grabbed it and he said, "This is what I want." In the way he grabbed it, the card tore. But it wasn't, she said, it wasn't a naughty tear. It wasn't like he was being a naughty kid. It was more like that is exact, like it hit him so
And
deeply of like, I feel so misunderstood. This is what I want.
wow.
And that was helpful for that kid to get in touch with that and to be able to express that. And thankfully, she said that the other kid had slightly higher emotional intelligence sort of levels already, and he was able to just be compassionate, understanding once he saw what had happened. So yeah, they definitely can help in all sorts of different settings.
Oh, that's powerful. Wow. And and then thinking about what are the most common challenges from your experience of workplace conflicts. And in my head I'm thinking about, the scenario of you and I, you
Mm-hmm,
saying, "Oh,
mm-hmm,
you're always talking over me." And in
mm-hmm,
my head, I learned years ago that whenever blame comes in, no one can make me feel like, "Oh, John Ford made me feel like an
mm-hmm,
idiot."
mm-hmm,
No,
mm-hmm.
I'm in control of my feelings. What would you say would be some of the most common? Would you say it's blame, or what are common ones?
Well, so I'm a big fan, as we alluded to, the four horsemen that
Okay.
Gottman references. So the defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and then the contempt. So I'd say defensiveness is huge. In other words, that I see over and over and over again. In other words, like people, if they're not feeling secure and someone says something that in some ways is perceived as attack, they're not going to just lie down and take it. They're going to want to sort of do something about it. But you mentioned another one, which is blame, which is not part of um, um, Gottman's four horsemen. And that's, I always sort of say when I'm engaging with folks in the workplace, I always throw that in. I always say that's my fifth, which is blame. In other words, when things go wrong in the workplace, and again, a lot of the time, the tone is set by leadership. Instead of having a learning conversation, they want to have a blame conversation. And when you have a blame conversation, it makes everyone scared because now their job's on the line. When people are afraid, instead of being revealing and owning my contribution to what went wrong, they're like concealing and hiding because they don't want to get into trouble. So I see that like that is sort of just as a like a makes things more challenging, as it were, in the workplace when you've got all of those sort of kind of things going on. I think probably for me more than anything, what I observe is the low levels of emotional intelligence as being the defining sort of factor. In other words, people that have a reasonable level of emotional intelligence, they've literally looked in the mirror and they've sort of done some work and self-reflected and seen both their strengths, but also maybe some of their weaknesses, the areas where they need to work on. They're generally able to navigate the life challenges that come along their way, and they may get stuck for a little while with someone, and then they'll listen and they'll reflect and they'll maybe speak to a mentor, and then they'll find a way through that without ever needing to see a John or Andrea. So in a certain sense, to me, a lot of the time, what's going on is as I say, folks that actually haven't done their work, and so they're not aware to the extent that they're projecting their unresolved issues. They're transferring, like, stuff from their childhood onto their manager and not realizing that the manager isn't their father, that kind of stuff. So, and that's where it gets tricky, because as a mediator, I'm not a therapist. My goal always in mediation is helping people come to agreement. And this may be where I bring in the soft skills that I'm able to sort of just in that brief little intersection of working with folks, help them upskill and develop the skills to navigate those situations. But again, more than anything, even with the skill set, you can have the skill set if you still haven't done your deeper emotional healing work. It's always going to mess with what's kind of going on. Another thing, I touched on it as well, which is the passive aggressive. So in my early days, so I'll just say my family of origin was very avoidant. So I didn't really get in much practice with anger at all during my childhood, other than the suppression of it. And then when I was married, my wife, she definitely, that was one of her strengths, was the ability to display and out duke me. And but I'll just say I'm happily divorced, and I learned so much. She was one of my greatest teachers, and one of them was in relation to anger. I really got to sit and be with that. And what I've really sort of come to see is that folks that have an issue with anger, they'll often show up on the radar. So people will have given them feedback and like, dude, you need to chill. You can't show up like that. So they often have that awareness. Whether they've looked in the mirror or someone's told them they've got an issue. And just as a quick little aside, I always say anger tells me this person cares strongly about something and their strategy isn't working. And so it brings a whole lot of energy for them to do something about it. And then tragically, they often act out, which brings us to that other key insight, which is the emotion is not the same as the behavior. But anyway, back to the anger, say like anger versus, and where I really want to contrast it with is the folks that don't display anger. They're the sweet, nice folks like me that are always getting along and like so people pleasing. And over the years, what I would find is the mediator, I don't know how many times I've mediated where I've had, say, a manager who displays anger and then this administrative support person who doesn't. And they'd be like, do you see how mean? Like, do you see how they displayed anger? And I'd be, yeah, I noticed that. But I'd also be thinking, but did you see how annoying you were when you forgot to do what you said that you would do? Or you made that joke about your manager's way that their voice gets raised as an indirect way of telling them that you don't like their voice being raised. So, what I'm trying to say in a not too elegant way, Andrea, is that over time I've come to find it easier working with folks that have anger issues than folks that don't, because they often, if they don't, they're going to be more on that passive aggressive side and they're not aware of it. They just think they're really nice, easygoing folks. At least the anger folks tend to know that they've got an issue and they tend to be aware that they're working on it and they're making some effort. And as I say, the folks on the other side of the house often are oblivious. I think they're really nice and easygoing and they can be very irritating to others.
Well, this has been fascinating. I can't believe that we're reaching the top of the hour here. And I did say that as we're talking, I could go on for a good week with these questions because we could keep going on tangents. But I want to just kind of bring it all in. What advice would you give to someone who wants to start having more empathy and effective communication in their work and professional life? Would you direct them to your empathy set? Where should we start?
Of course, I'd love it if folks were interested. Again, getting a talking stick could be helpful. I would say probably the more helpful thing are getting either the cards or the app. The app's easy to download, and it provides you a way of sort of just essentially tracking what's going on in your emotional life. So those are nice tools to have, and especially if you're feeling like you're lacking on the emotional literacy side of the house. In other words, you're needing a little bit of hand holding or prompting to get you in touch with what you're feeling. I think these kind of tools can be helpful. But really, what I would say beyond that is I would go back to my time in working with the San and the Kalahari, which is the not speaking as wrongdoing, and encourage people to find that courage to speak up. There's it's called the conflict style instrument that can be helpful as well for people to take. There's all sorts of free versions of it available. But one of the things that helps us understand is that we don't, when we encounter the inevitable conflict we encounter in life, it doesn't always call on us to speak up, but it's often knowing when to speak up and when not to. So in general, my encouragement is going to be, if something's bothering you emotionally, don't ignore it. Have some kind of inquiry, be curious about what's going on. And if you conclude that these feelings that you're having that are bothering you about a particular relationship um, are about something that's really important, in other words, the issue at stake is significant, and also the person with whom you have a relationship is also significant to you. In other words, it's a work colleague or someone that you have to work with. If those two elements are there, important issue, important relationship, then the theory always is actually that you collaborate. So if that's going on, then I'd say this is not a situation where you can just look the other way and wish to just sort of hope it's going to go away on its own. Then you need to find that courage to speak up. And another key thing, and both in conflict resolution and also in negotiation, is preparation. Too often people stumble into these conversations or they have them at the worst times. So preparing, giving thought to when and where, going into the conversation, taking the time to figure out what am I feeling and what is that other person needing? What am I feeling and needing? And what is that other person feeling and needing before you get in there? And again, remember that thing I said, so often you're going to have your ideal solution. Like, I want you to do this and I want you to do this. Always be willing to go and say, behind the strategy that I want to employ, behind the demand that I have, what are my underlying needs? What are that other person's underlying needs? And that's often going to lead you towards solutions. But I think in essence, what I'm really trying to say is, unless it's one of those rare situations where you can ignore it, the big thing is actually speaking up, preparing, and then gearing yourself up to have a balanced conversation where you talk about feelings and needs.
It's brilliant. Thank you so much, John Ford, for this. This has been very helpful. And it's just the beginning because I hear it, but now putting it into place, into action is where the work comes in, right?
That's right.
Just some final thoughts. Do you have any final thoughts to close out? Just what do you want
Yeah,
us to take
I
away?
think I was, well, I mainly, I want to thank you, Andrea, because I really enjoyed being able to share, and you provided me with great prompts to be able to share a little bit about what I've been doing. And more than anything, I want to express my appreciation for that. And I suppose the other thing, then, if you're asking me for something, I wrote a book called Peace at Work: The HR Manager's Guide to Workplace Mediation, and I always remember struggling with that title, Peace at Work, because everyone thinks like peace, it comes from peace on earth, peace on earth, peace at work, that kind of thing. And like, are you naive, like really hoping for peace? And I'm maybe it's that John Lennon song, Imagine. I'm a dreamer, and I like to believe that we can do better, and we still have a long way to go. But I do believe the arc of history is moving us in the right direction to more, to being more conscious, to being more loving, to being more kind, and that's the kind of world that I'm for.
I'm with you. I'm with you on all of it. Thank you so much, John Ford. This has been phenomenal. I'll put the links to your empathy set, cards and app in the show notes. And just thank you so much. This has been eye-opening for me.
Thank you, Andrea, and I'd be very happy to come back if you ever wanted me.
Absolutely.